My husband made a disgusting comment about a young woman at the hospital, then called me a name in front of 8 people. I picked up my bag and left. Now he told everyone I abandoned an injured man. My husband looked at a young woman walking across a hospital waiting room and said something so deeply shameful about her body that the receptionist put down her phone. A stranger turned his head, and the young woman herself slowed her step. I was standing right next to him. I said his name. He said what? I said stop. He turned to me in front of every single person in that room and called me a name I will not repeat and told me I was the problem. So I picked up my bag, told him to call his brother, and walked out of the hospital. That was Tuesday. By Thursday he had told 7 people that I had abandoned an injured, disoriented man in a hospital waiting room and left him alone and helpless. He told them this with the confidence of someone who understood that his version only worked if mine stayed silent. I had been silent for 17 years. I was done being silent. Let me tell you what kind of man Marcus was before that waiting room, because the waiting room did not create him. It just finally said it loud enough for other people to hear. We had been married 17 years. Good years on the surface, the kind of marriage that looks solid from the outside because it is old enough to have history and stable enough to have routine. We had built a real life together, careers and a home, and the accumulated texture of 2 people who have chosen each other long enough that the choice has become habit. I had loved him. I want to say that clearly because this story is not about a marriage that was always wrong. It is about a pattern I absorbed for so long that I forgot I was absorbing it. The comments started early. Not constant, not loud, just consistent. A remark under his breath at a restaurant. An observation in the car after a party. The specific kind of comment that a man delivers quietly to his wife as though offering her something, as though shared contempt for a stranger's appearance is a form of intimacy. The first time he did it I said that is not funny. He said I was too sensitive. The second time I went quiet. The third time I changed the subject. By year 5 I had developed such fluency at absorbing and redirecting that I no longer registered the absorbing as a choice. It had become atmospheric. It had become just Marcus. That was my failure. I'm going to own it clearly, and then I'm going to tell you what his failure looked like when it finally ran out of room to hide. The MRI was for a disc injury in his lower back. Real pain. I had been present for all of it, driving him to appointments, adjusting our schedule, taking on more at home. I was the good wife doing the good wife things, and I arrived at that hospital on a Tuesday with no intention of leaving alone. I waited 2 hours. I had coffee from the machine and a book I did not read, and the specific patience of someone who has been showing up for 17 years and considers showing up a foundational identity. He came through the double doors at 2:14 in the afternoon. Slightly soft from the medication, not disoriented the way he later claimed to everyone, just relaxed in the way the sedative makes you relaxed. He saw me and smiled. I took his arm. We were walking toward the exit when the young woman crossed the waiting room ahead of us. She was maybe 25. She was walking fast, carrying a folder, dressed professionally, completely minding her own business. Marcus watched her cross the room and said what he said. I'm not going to print the exact words because they belong in the category of things that degrade everyone they pass through. What I will tell you is that it was about her body. It was specific. It was said at a volume calibrated for the room rather than for my ear, and that calibration told me something I had not let myself know before, which was that this had never been something he said only to me. This had been something he said to rooms. I had simply always been the only one listening. The receptionist put down her phone. The man 2 seats over turned his head. The young woman slowed. I stopped walking. I said, Marcus. He said, what? I said, quietly, you need to stop. He looked at me the way he had always looked at me when I said I didn't find that funny, the look that said I was interrupting something that did not require my opinion. He said, relax. It's just a comment, I said. That woman heard you. Those people heard you. Stop, he said, loud enough for all of them to hear, you're embarrassing me. I said, you embarrassed yourself. That was when he said the name. Loud. Clear. In a hospital waiting room. In front of the receptionist who had put down her phone and the man who had turned his head, and at least 4 other people who were suddenly very interested in their own shoes. I stood there for exactly 3 seconds. I counted them later in the car, the way you count things when you are trying to understand a moment. 3 seconds of standing next to a man who had just called me a name in public after making a deeply shameful comment in public and looking at me like I was still the problem. And then I picked up my bag. I said, call your brother. And I walked out. I sat in the car for 10 minutes. Not crying. Not shaking. Sitting with the specific stillness of someone who has done something they cannot undo and is deciding whether they want to undo it. I did not want to undo it. I started the car and I drove home and I sat in our kitchen and I waited. His brother picked him up 40 minutes later. He texted me that Marcus was physically fine and that he suspected Marcus's account of events had some significant gaps. I said the gaps were significant. He said he thought so. He also said, and I want to include this because it matters, that Marcus had told him in the car that I had simply walked out without warning because I was upset about nothing. He had already started. 40 minutes later, and in a car with his own brother, he had already started building the version. Marcus walked in at 6 p.m. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table and he said the medication had made him less filtered. I said I had heard his unfiltered version before and it had been quieter but not different. He said I should have stayed. I said he had called me a name in front of a room full of people after making a deeply shameful comment in front of a room full of people, and I had not been willing to stand next to him after that. He said I had abandoned him when he was vulnerable. I said he had not been vulnerable. He had been sedated enough to let the volume up on something he usually kept just below the level where I could prove it. He said that was not fair. I said I did not care about fair right now. I cared about what had happened in that room and I was going to need him to account for it. He did not account for it that night. He went to bed early citing his back pain and I sat in the kitchen and thought about 17 years of comments delivered at the volume designed to stay between us and understood that the only reason Tuesday had been louder was because the medication had reduced his calibration, and that the calibration had always been intentional, and that I had been the beneficiary and the victim of it simultaneously for 17 years without fully understanding either role. By Thursday morning, 3 of my friends had messaged me with gentle concern. Each message was a variation of the same thing. They had heard I had left Marcus alone at the hospital after his procedure and they were worried about us. No comment in any of these messages. No name. Just a concerned wife who had left a struggling husband in a waiting room. His version, moving through our social world at speed, was clean and simple and required nothing from anyone except sympathy for him and mild concern about me. My version required people to believe something uncomfortable about a man they had known for years and had no reason to see differently. I stared at those 3 messages and I understood for the first time how deliberately this had been constructed. Not just Tuesday. The whole 17 years. The low volume had not been embarrassment. It had been liability management. He had always kept the comments quiet enough that I was the only witness, which meant I was the only one who could contest him, which meant any contest between us was automatically he said, she said. Tuesday had been louder than usual and he had immediately moved to contain the loudness by controlling the narrative before I could offer one. He had done this before I even knew there was a narrative to contest. I was 41 years old and I had just understood something about my marriage that I should have understood in year 2. I drafted the group chat message. The full account. The comment, the name, the 3 witnesses, all of it. My finger was on send. My phone rang. It was Marcus's brother. He said, "Don't send it." I said I needed people to have accurate information. He said, "I know. But the group chat makes it a war and wars don't have winners, they just have people who run out of ammunition first. You have the truth. That's better than a group chat. Use it better." I held the phone. I held the drafted message. I asked him how he knew about the group chat. He said he knew his brother and he knew me and he had called because he had a feeling. I said, "What do I do?" He said, "Go back to the hospital tomorrow." I went back to the hospital the next morning. And what I found there was the beginning of the end of Marcus's version of events. The receptionist was at the same desk. I walked up and I said I had been there the previous afternoon with my husband and something had happened and I needed to ask her directly whether she had witnessed it. She looked at me for a moment, the look of someone deciding, and then she said, "The comment." I said yes. She said, "I heard it. I also heard what he called you." I said I knew. She said, "I thought you were right to leave." I thanked her. She said she would not put anything in writing but she would tell the truth if someone asked her directly. I said that was enough. I went home and I called Marcus into the kitchen and I sat across from him and I said, "I went back to the hospital this morning." He went still in the specific way of someone whose calculation has just changed. I said, "The receptionist remembers everything. The comment and the name and the volume of both." He said she would not get involved. I said she already had. He said this was getting out of hand. I said it had been out of hand for 17 years and I was the only one who had known it and that was over now. He said I was threatening him. I said I was informing him. There was a difference and I needed him to understand it. He said, quietly, "What do you want?" I said, "I want you to call the 7 people you told your version to and tell them the accurate version." He said he could not do that. I said, "Then I will." He said I was going to humiliate him. I said, "You humiliated yourself in a hospital waiting room in front of 8 people. I'm just making sure the people who know us have accurate information about what happened." He said, "This will destroy us." I said, "You should have thought about that before you said what you said and called me what you called me." He did not make the calls. I knew he would not make the calls. What he did instead was call me 4 times over the next 2 hours, each call a different approach, first the apology version, then the let's talk about this version, then the you're overreacting version, then the I'm scared version. I let the last one go to voicemail. I sat at my kitchen table and I called each of the 3 friends who had messaged me, one by one, and I told them what had actually happened. Not the managed version. The full version. The comment and the name and the receptionist and the 17 years of lower volume versions of the same thing that I had absorbed and called our normal. The first friend was quiet for a long time and then said she was sorry I had been carrying it alone. The second friend said she had noticed something at a dinner 3 years ago, a comment Marcus had made that she had dismissed, and that what I was telling her made her feel she had dismissed it too easily. The third friend cried. She said she had always liked Marcus, and that she was having trouble holding what I was telling her alongside that. I said I understood. I said I had been having that same trouble for 17 years and that it did not make the thing I was telling her less true. By the end of those 3 calls, the 7 people Marcus had told had become people with a second version available to them. Not my word against his in the abstract. My word supported by the specific detail of a receptionist who had witnessed it and a 17-year pattern that I described with the precision of someone who had been watching it long enough to know its shape exactly. Marcus came home that evening and sat down across from me and did not try any of the previous approaches. He sat in the silence for a while and then he said, "How long have you been keeping track?" I said, "I haven't been keeping track. I've been living inside it. I just remember it because it kept happening." He said, "I didn't think you were paying attention." I said, "I was always paying attention. I just stopped saying anything because saying anything became more work than absorbing it and I was tired." He said, "I didn't know it was that bad." I said, "You didn't let yourself know. There's a difference." That sentence did something to him. I watched it land. Not the defensive recalibration of someone managing a conversation. Something slower and more genuine, the specific stillness of a person who has heard something true about themselves that they cannot immediately neutralize. He sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "I need to talk to someone." I said, "Yes. You do." He called a therapist the next morning. He made the appointment himself. He told me about it without being asked and without framing it as something he was doing for me. He said he had been thinking about what I had said, about the difference between not knowing and not letting yourself know, and that his therapist had a cancellation on Thursday and he was taking it. I said okay. He said he was also going to call 2 of the 7 people. I said okay again. He made the calls. Not all 7, 2, the ones he said he could face. I do not know exactly what he said in those calls because I was not there for them and he did not script them with me. What I know is that both people reached out to me afterward with messages that told me he had been honest, that he had described what had actually happened without softening it, that he had not asked either of them to choose a side but had simply corrected the record. One of them said she had more respect for him after the call than she had before it, which I thought was the most complicated and accurate possible response. I went to stay with my sister for 5 days. Not because the marriage was over, I had not decided that yet, but because I needed to be somewhere that was not saturated with 17 years of the thing I was trying to think clearly about. My sister asked no leading questions. She fed me and let me sit in her living room and process, and the processing produced something I had not expected, which was a reckoning with my own choices alongside the reckoning with his. I had not been only a victim of the pattern. I had also been a participant in its maintenance. I had laughed once or twice. I had absorbed and redirected and accepted his framing of my discomfort as my sensitivity for 17 years. That was not nothing. That was my part. And owning my part was not the same as excusing his, but it was necessary if I was going to understand how we had gotten here and whether we could get somewhere different. I came home on a Sunday. He was in the kitchen. He did not make a speech. He said welcome home and made me coffee and we sat at the table and began the most honest conversation we had ever had in 17 years of marriage. It lasted 3 hours. It covered the waiting room and the pattern and the 17 years and my part in the maintenance of the pattern and what it would require from both of us to build something different. It was not comfortable. It was the most real we had ever been with each other and the realness had arrived 17 years late and cost more than it should have cost to reach. We started couples therapy the following week. I'm going to be honest about where that therapy has taken us because the honest version is more useful than the tidy one. The comments have stopped. Completely. Whether they have stopped because he has genuinely changed or because he is now aware that the volume control no longer offers him the protection it used to is something the therapy is helping me evaluate. What I can tell you is that he is doing the work with a consistency that is observable, that the therapist has said things to him in our joint sessions that have landed in ways that my 17 years of private signals apparently could not reach, and that the man sitting across from me at our kitchen table is trying in a way that is different from the managed attempts of before. What the therapy has not done is give me back the Tuesday afternoons of 17 years when I absorbed something I should have said something about. That accounting is mine and I am not going to give it to him to carry. I made choices. I took the easier option. I let the pattern become atmospheric because atmospheric was quieter than confrontation and I was tired. I am not proud of that, and I am not going to pretend it did not happen in the interest of being a cleaner kind of wrong person. The 7 people Marcus told his version to now mostly have mine. The ones who were decent about it are still in our lives. 2 have drifted in the way people drift when the truth about someone they liked is complicated. I do not chase the drifters. The people who need a clean story with 1 villain and 1 victim are not people whose presence I need to fight for anymore. I think about the waiting room on ordinary days. The 3 seconds between the name and the bag. I do not think I was wrong to leave. I think a person who calls you a name in a public space after a public act of degradation toward a stranger has forfeited the right to your continued presence in that space, regardless of the medical context and regardless of the 17 years. What I think I was wrong about was every moment before it. Every absorbed comment. Every redirected conversation. Every time I said I didn't find that funny and accepted the response that I was too sensitive without pushing further. All of those moments were the real mistake. The waiting room was just the place where all of those moments finally ran out of room. Say something the first time. Not the 17th year. Not a hospital waiting room with 8 witnesses. The first time you hear it and feel the thing you felt that you redirected and absorbed and called your sensitivity. That feeling is not sensitivity. That feeling is your instinct telling you what something is before your mind has decided whether to call it by its name. Call it by its name. The first time. Before the years accumulate into a Tuesday afternoon. Before you are sitting in a parking lot deciding whether to go back inside. Before you are the wife who left. When you could have been the woman who said clearly and early and without apology. That is not acceptable. Not in private. Not in public. Not at any volume. Not ever. I know what I should have said. I know when I should have said it. I just said it 17 years too late. In a hospital waiting room. With 8 witnesses. And I am still paying for the silence that came before it. Every single day.